I was standing in my own kitchen, refilling a glass of water, when I heard my daughter's voice through the wall. Low and careful. The way people talk when they think no one else is listening. We just need to find a place for her, somewhere nice, but somewhere. She can't keep living alone like this, and honestly, it's become a burden on all of us. My son agreed. Neither of them knew that the house they were standing in, the house they'd all gathered in that Sunday to discuss what to do with me, belonged on every deed and every title, entirely to me. My name is Margaret. I'm 71 years old, and for the past 3 years, I have lived alone in a modest house on Cedar Lane. It's the same town where I raised my 3 children, Diane, Robert, and Susan, after their father died of a heart attack when the youngest, Susan, was only 19. I want to start this story further back than that Sunday afternoon, though, because I think the full weight of what happened only makes sense if you understand what came before it. The 4 decades of quiet, largely invisible work that built the life my children now stood in my kitchen discussing how to dismantle. My husband, Walter, was a good man in many ways, but he was not, if I'm honest, a particularly careful one when it came to money. He believed in living well now rather than saving cautiously, for later, a philosophy that worked well enough while he was alive and earning a steady income as a mid-level manager at a manufacturing plant. But that left me at 52, a widow, with 3 children still finishing high school and college, and almost nothing in savings beyond a modest life insurance payout, and the house we'd lived in for over 20 years. I want to describe, honestly, what those years immediately after Walter's death actually looked like, because I don't think my children, even now, fully understand them. I took a job as a bookkeeper for a small regional trucking company, work I'd done briefly decades earlier before Walter and I married, and found, to my own surprise, that I had a genuine talent for it, an eye for numbers, for finding small inefficiencies in a company's spending, for making modest resources stretch considerably further than anyone expected. Within 2 years, the owner of that company, a gruff but fair man named Harold Jennings, had promoted me to managing the company's entire finance department, a position I held for the next 18 years. If you've ever quietly rebuilt an entire financial life after losing a spouse, doing work nobody in your family fully understood or asked about, I think you'll recognize a lot of what's coming. And if that's part of your story too, I'd deeply appreciate you subscribing, because this channel exists specifically for stories like this one. I want to be honest about something that I think matters enormously to understanding everything that followed. I never told my children, growing up, exactly how much I earned, or exactly how carefully I'd begun investing whatever I could save each month, starting modestly in my mid-50s, and growing considerably more sophisticated in my approach as the years went on, and I learned more, largely through careful independent study, and a series of increasingly serious conversations with a financial advisor I trusted, a woman named Patricia who became, over the years, something closer to a friend than simply a professional contact. By the time Diane, my eldest, was ready to buy her first home at 29, I had, without any of my children fully realizing it, built a modest but genuinely substantial portfolio of savings and investments. Nothing flashy, nothing that would have suggested wealth to anyone who simply looked at how I lived, still driving the same reliable but unremarkable sedan I'd bought a decade earlier, still living in the same modest house on Cedar Lane, still clipping coupons out of habits formed during leaner years that never quite left me, even once the financial pressure had eased considerably. When Diane came to me, nervous and apologetic, explaining that she and her husband had been approved for a mortgage but were still nearly $40,000 short of the down payment they needed for the house they wanted, I made a decision that I've never regretted, though it started a pattern I perhaps should have thought through more carefully at the time. I gave her the money. Not as a loan, exactly, though I don't think either of us used precise language about it at the time. Simply as help, the kind of help a mother wants to give her children when she's finally, after years of careful work, in a position to give it. 2 years later, Robert, my middle child, came to me with a similar situation. A promising, but financially precarious small business opportunity. A chance to buy into a well-established auto repair shop, whose aging owner was looking to retire and sell to someone he trusted. If only Robert could raise the capital quickly enough to beat out other interested buyers. I gave him the money too. Again, without much formal structure around the arrangement. Simply because I could, and because helping my children build stable lives felt, at the time, like the natural continuation of everything I'd worked towards since Walter's death. Susan, my youngest, needed help differently. Not a single large sum, but ongoing, periodic assistance through her 20s. As she navigated an unstable early career in graphic design, freelance work that paid unpredictably and left her, more than once, unable to cover rent during lean months. I helped her too, consistently, quietly, in amounts that individually seemed modest, but that, added together, over more than a decade, represented a genuinely substantial portion of what I'd built. I think many parents who've helped their adult children financially, in ways that felt natural and loving at the time, will recognize this pattern. And if you've navigated something similar, I hope you'll subscribe, because these are exactly the family dynamics I explore in these stories. I want to be clear that I don't regret any single one of these decisions, taken individually. What I've come to understand, only in retrospect, looking back over the past decade with considerably more clarity than I had while I was living through it, is how a pattern of generous, quiet giving, extended consistently over many years, can gradually shift a family's entire understanding of who depends on whom. How, without anyone quite intending it, the person doing the giving can slowly become invisible in the family's actual accounting of itself, taken for granted precisely because her support had always simply been there, reliable and unremarkable. Like weather. About 8 years ago, when Diane and her husband were considering upgrading from their first home to a larger house, better suited to their growing family, I made what I now recognize as a pivotal decision, one that set the stage, unknowingly, for everything that would eventually happen that Sunday afternoon in my kitchen. Rather than simply gifting Diane another lump sum toward a down payment, Patricia, my financial advisor, suggested a different structure. One that would actually benefit me considerably, from a tax and estate planning perspective, while still providing my children the help they needed. I would purchase the properties myself, outright, using funds from my accumulated savings and investments, and allow my children to live in them, initially under informal arrangements, with modest rent payments that were, in practice, closer to covering property taxes and maintenance than anything resembling market rate rent. Over the following 6 years, this arrangement extended to all 3 of my children. Diane and her family moved into a house I purchased outright in a good school district, considerably nicer than anything they could have afforded on their own income at that stage of their careers. Robert's auto repair shop, which had grown successful under his management, operated out of a commercial property I'd similarly purchased, with Robert paying me a modest, below-market lease that he understood, I believe, primarily as a formality rather than anything resembling genuine market rent. Susan, once her design career finally stabilized in her early 30s, moved into a smaller but genuinely lovely house I'd purchased in a neighborhood she loved but couldn't have afforded independently. I want to be honest that I never hid any of this, exactly, in the sense of actively lying about it. but I also never made a particular point of emphasizing it, of reminding my children, in ongoing conversations, precisely whose name appeared on each property's deed. Part of this was simple practicality. Patricia and I had structured everything through a family trust, primarily for tax efficiency and long-term estate planning purposes, and the day-to-day management of that trust happened quietly, through paperwork and periodic meetings with Patricia and our estate attorney, rarely surfacing in ordinary family conversation. But part of it, if I'm honest with myself now, was something more complicated. A quiet, perhaps unconscious desire to be needed by my children in ways that went beyond simple financial provision, to be seen as generous and helpful rather than as the actual, structural foundation upon which their entire, adult financial stability rested. If any part of this resonates, building genuine security for your family so quietly that they eventually stop seeing exactly how much of their stability depends on you. I think you'll understand exactly what's coming, and I hope you'll subscribe, because this is precisely the kind of quiet, complicated family dynamic I try to explore honestly in these stories. About 3 years ago, my own circumstances shifted in a way that, I now understand, set the stage for everything that followed. I retired from the trucking company after 35 years of employment, a milestone that should have felt like a genuine accomplishment, but that instead left me, somewhat unexpectedly, feeling considerably more isolated than I'd anticipated. My daily structure, built for decades around a demanding, engaging job, simply disappeared, and I found myself in my late 60s, navigating a kind of quiet loneliness that I hadn't fully prepared for, living alone in the same house on Cedar Lane, where I'd raised my children, now considerably too large and too quiet for one person. I began, in that first year of retirement, developing a habit that I recognize now was probably more about combating loneliness than any genuine practical necessity. Calling my children frequently, sometimes daily, checking in about small things, asking about their days in a level of detail that I suspect, looking back, occasionally felt intrusive rather than warmly attentive. I also began, somewhat more concerning in retrospect, experiencing minor lapses in memory that, while almost certainly within the range of normal aging, rather than anything more serious, apparently became a subject of quiet, ongoing concern among my 3 children, conversations they had among themselves, that I only became fully aware of much later. I misplaced my car keys with unusual frequency during that first year of retirement. I called Diane once, in a moment of genuine confusion, unable to immediately recall what day of the week it was, a lapse that resolved itself within minutes, but that apparently alarmed her considerably at the time. I repeated a particular story about my own childhood at a family dinner, not realizing I'd already told the same story earlier that same evening, a repetition that Robert apparently noticed and mentioned to his siblings afterward with real concern. I want to be honest that I understand, now, why these individual moments, accumulated over many months, might have genuinely worried my children. I don't fault them for their concern. Exactly, even though I've come to understand it, was built on a somewhat incomplete picture of my actual cognitive state, which subsequent testing, prompted by that very concern, would eventually confirm was well within normal range for my age, showing no signs of dementia or any other serious cognitive decline. But at the time, without that testing yet completed, my children's worry apparently crystallized into something more concrete than simple concern. A quiet, ongoing family conversation about what to do about me. Conversations I was almost entirely excluded from, held instead among the 3 of them, sometimes over group text messages, sometimes during phone calls I only learned about afterward. The Sunday afternoon that changed everything began. From my perspective, As an entirely ordinary family gathering, Diane had organized a family dinner at her house. The house I owned, though this detail, I want to emphasize, occurred to me only distantly in the background of my thinking, rather than as any kind of active daily awareness. I arrived a bit early, as I often did, letting myself in through the back door with the spare key Diane had given me years earlier, intending to help with dinner preparations before the others arrived. I heard voices coming from the living room. Diane, Robert, and Susan, apparently already there, having arrived earlier than I'd expected, engaged in a conversation that I initially assumed was simply ordinary family chatter before I registered, gradually, what they were actually discussing. I looked into a few places. Diane was saying, her voice careful, deliberately quiet. "There's one about 20 minutes from here. Really nice actually. Assisted living but not full nursing care, private rooms, activities throughout the day. It's not cheap, but between the three of us, we could manage it." "I still think it's premature," Robert said, though his tone suggested more resignation than genuine disagreement. "But I get it. She's not safe living alone anymore, not really. The keys thing, the day she couldn't remember what day it was. I keep thinking about what happens if something actually goes wrong when none of us are there. We just need to find a place for her." Diane continued, her voice softening slightly, though the underlying sentiment remained unmistakably clear. "Somewhere nice, but somewhere. She can't keep living alone like this, and honestly, it's become a burden on all of us. Managing her care from a distance, worrying constantly about what might happen." I stood in the kitchen, holding a glass of water I'd poured automatically upon entering, and felt something shift inside me that I find difficult to fully describe even now, months later. It wasn't quite anger, not in that first moment. It was something closer to a strange, disorienting grief. The specific grief of realizing, suddenly and completely, that your own children have been having an entire conversation about your future, your autonomy, your very capacity to manage your own life, without including you in it at all. I think many parents, as they age, face some version of this moment. Children, who genuinely love them, but who begin making decisions about their care, without fully including them in the conversation. If you've navigated something like this yourself, either as the parent or the adult child, I'd love to hear your perspective in the comments, and I hope you'll subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of difficult, important family dynamic I want to keep exploring honestly. I didn't announce myself immediately. I stood in that kitchen for what felt like a very long time, though it was probably only a minute or two, listening to my children continue discussing logistics, costs, timelines, how to broach the subject with me in a way that wouldn't feel, in Susan's words, too harsh. I heard Robert mention, almost as an aside, that we'd need to figure out what to do with her house too, probably sell it, put the proceeds toward covering the care home costs. A comment that, more than almost anything else in that conversation, crystallized for me exactly how completely my children had already mentally filed away my current life, my home, my independence, as things to be efficiently managed and liquidated rather than respected and preserved. I finally walked into the living room, glass of water still in hand, and the three of them fell silent immediately, the particular guilty silence of people who've just realized they've been overheard. I didn't raise my voice. I want to describe, as precisely as I can, the specific calm that settled over me in that moment, a calm that surprised me nearly as much as it apparently surprised them. I asked them, simply, how long they'd been having this conversation. Diane, to her credit, didn't try to deflect or minimize. She told me, honestly, that they'd been discussing it for several months, prompted by genuine concern about the incidents I've described, wanting to find the right moment and the right approach. before bringing it to me directly. I asked them whether they'd considered, at any point during those several months of discussion, actually asking me how I felt about my own cognitive state, my own sense of my capacity to continue living independently. There was an uncomfortable silence. Robert eventually said that they'd worried I might become defensive or upset if they raised it too directly, that they'd wanted to have a clear plan in place before discussing it with me, so the conversation would feel productive rather than alarming. I told them, calmly, that I understood their concern came from love, and that I appreciated, genuinely, that they cared enough about my well-being to think seriously about my long-term care. But I told them, too, that what I just overheard felt considerably less like love, and considerably more like 3 adult children efficiently planning the liquidation of their mother's autonomy, discussing her house as an asset to be sold rather than a home to be respected, without ever once considering that she might have valuable input into decisions about her own life. I want to be honest that what followed was not, in the moment, some triumphant, dramatic confrontation. It was a longer, more difficult, more genuinely uncomfortable conversation than that. One where I asked my children, directly, to tell me exactly what specific behaviors had worried them, and listened, as calmly as I could manage, while they described the misplaced keys, the confused moment about the day of the week, the repeated story at dinner. I told them, honestly, that I understood why those moments had concerned them, and that I would be entirely willing to undergo proper cognitive testing with my doctor to establish, with actual medical evidence rather than accumulated anecdotes, whether there was genuine cause for concern. But I told them something else, too, something that I think surprised all 3 of them considerably, more than anything else I said that afternoon. I told them that regardless of what any testing revealed, I needed them to understand something about the house we were currently sitting in, and about Robert's shop, and about Susan's house as well. I explained, as plainly and unemotionally as I could manage, the actual structure of the family trust Patricia and I had established years earlier, that I owned, outright, every property they'd been living or working in for years, that the modest payments they made toward rent or lease were, in practice, far below actual market value, that the entire financial foundation of stability they'd each built their adult lives upon had been, quietly, entirely dependent on decisions I'd made and continued to make, decisions that I retained full legal authority over. I watched their faces change over the course of that explanation, in ways I've thought about often since. There was confusion first, as each of them tried to reconcile the house we've been discussing selling to pay for Mom's care with the house Mom actually owns and has allowed us to live in for years. Then there was something closer to genuine shock, as the full implications settled in. That the conversation they'd been having about efficiently managing my transition into assisted living and liquidating my modest house on Cedar Lane had entirely overlooked the fact that the properties they themselves lived in represented a vastly larger and more significant asset, one I controlled completely. If you're a parent who's quietly built significant security for your family without them fully understanding the extent of it, I think you'll recognize the particular complexity of a moment like this one. And if this resonates, I hope you'll subscribe, because these are exactly the layered, complicated family dynamics I want to keep exploring. I didn't threaten them, in that moment, or afterward, with removing them from their homes or businesses. That was never my intention, and I want to be clear about that, because I think it would be easy to hear this story and assume it builds towards some dramatic act of eviction or punishment. What I did instead was considerably quieter, and I think ultimately more meaningful. I told them that going forward, I expected to be included as a genuine, equal participant in any conversation about my own life, my own care, my own future, not because of the financial leverage I apparently held, though that leverage was now undeniably visible to all of us, but because I was still, entirely, a competent adult capable of participating meaningfully in decisions about my own well-being. I also told them, and this felt important to say clearly, that I intended to proceed with the cognitive testing I'd mentioned, not because I necessarily believed anything was seriously wrong, but because I thought it was reasonable, given their genuine concern, to establish an actual medical baseline rather than continuing to operate on accumulated anecdotal worry. I scheduled that testing the following week, and I want to share, because I think it matters for the shape of this story, that the results came back entirely normal. Some very mild, age-appropriate changes in processing speed that my doctor described as well, within expected range for a woman of 71, nothing resembling the kind of cognitive decline that would justify the level of concern my children had developed. I shared those results with my children directly, in a follow-up conversation considerably calmer than the one that had precipitated the testing in the first place. I watched a complicated mixture of relief and, I think, genuine embarrassment cross each of their faces as I explained the results. Robert, in particular, apologized quite directly, acknowledging that they'd allowed a handful of ordinary, age-related lapses to snowball, in their own anxious imagination, into something considerably more alarming than the actual evidence supported. I want to describe, now, some of what's changed in the months since that Sunday afternoon, because I think it matters as much as the confrontation itself. My relationship with all three of my children has shifted in ways that feel, to me, considerably more honest than what came before, even though the shift required real discomfort to arrive at. Diane calls me now, not just to check in with the underlying anxious question of whether I'm managing my keys and my calendar adequately, but to actually ask my opinion about decisions in her own life. Treating me, I think for the first time in several years, as someone whose judgment she genuinely values, rather than someone whose judgment she's quietly begun to doubt. Robert and I have had several long conversations about the auto repair shop. Conversations where he's asked me, directly, about the actual terms of our lease arrangement, and where we've worked together, with Patricia's guidance, to formalize something closer to a genuine business arrangement, rather than the informal, somewhat paternalistic structure we'd operated under previously. I think he's found, somewhat to his own surprise, that treating our financial relationship with more transparency and formality has actually strengthened rather than complicated his sense of ownership over his own business's success. Susan, my youngest, has been perhaps the most reflective of the three in the months since. She told me, in a long conversation a few months after that Sunday, that overhearing herself discuss finding a place for me, in the same tone she might have used to discuss finding a place for an item of furniture that no longer fit in a room, had genuinely disturbed her once she had time to sit with it. She apologized in a way that felt considerably more substantive than a simple acknowledgement of having hurt my feelings. An actual reckoning, as far as I could tell, with how easily even loving children can slide into treating an aging parent as a problem, to be efficiently managed rather than a full person to be consulted and respected. I don't want to present this as a story with a simple, tidy resolution, because I don't think it is one. I am, in fact, 71 years old, and I understand that some version of the concerns my children raised that Sunday will likely become more legitimate as the years continue to pass. I don't have any illusion that I will never need additional support, potentially even the kind of assisted living arrangement they were discussing that afternoon. What I needed, And what I believe I've now established, going forward, is simply the expectation that whatever conversations happen about my future will happen with me, as a full participant, rather than around me. As though I were already incapable of meaningful input. I've also made some changes to how I manage the family trust going forward. Changes that I think a more mature, more transparent version of the arrangement we'd operated under. For years, Patricia and I have restructured the various property arrangements into something considerably more formal and clearly documented. With each of my children now fully aware, in specific and concrete terms, of exactly what they own, what they're leasing, and under what terms, removing, I hope, the kind of ambiguity that allowed all of us, myself included, to drift into a family dynamic where genuine gratitude coexisted, uncomfortably, with an underlying willingness to discuss liquidating my home without asking me first. I think about that Sunday afternoon often, more than almost any other moment in recent years. Not with lingering anger, exactly, though I won't pretend there wasn't real hurt in that initial moment of overhearing my own children's plans for me. What I keep returning to, instead, is something closer to a complicated kind of clarity. An understanding that the quiet, consistent generosity I'd extended to my children for decades, exactly because I never made a point of emphasizing it, had allowed all of us to lose sight of a fundamental truth. That the stability they'd built their adult lives upon depended entirely on my continued judgment and agency. The very qualities they'd begun, quietly and out of genuine but incomplete concern, to plan around rather than consult. I built a life, after Walter died, out of considerably more resilience and careful judgment than anyone in my family, myself included at times, fully gave me credit for. I raised 3 children largely alone, built a career I never expected to have real talent for, and quietly constructed a level of financial security that supported not just my own retirement, but the entire adult lives of my children, without ever needing to announce or emphasize exactly how much of their stability depended on decisions I continued to make. And when those same children, prompted by genuine but incomplete concern, began planning to relocate me into a care facility and liquidate the modest home I'd built my own independent life within, I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I still possessed exactly the clarity, exactly the calm, deliberate judgment that should have made clear to all of us that I was. I was nowhere near as fragile or as manageable as that Sunday afternoon conversation had assumed. I don't know exactly what the coming years hold for me, or for my relationship with my children. I know that whatever conversations happen about my future, going forward, will happen with my full participation, informed by actual medical evidence, rather than accumulated anxiety, and grounded in a clearer, more honest understanding, on everyone's part, of exactly what our family's financial foundation actually looks like and who has built it. And I know, too, that the particular quiet I felt standing in that kitchen, listening to my children discuss my future without me taught me something I hadn't fully understood before that moment. That love, however genuine, can sometimes slide, almost without anyone noticing, into a kind of quiet condescension. Treating the people we care for as problems to be efficiently solved, rather than full people to be respected and consulted. I don't think my children meant any harm by that conversation. But I know now, with a clarity I didn't have before that Sunday, exactly how important it is to make sure that even the most loving family arrangements never allow anyone, however capable and however generous, to become invisible in the story of their own life.